women joined the throngs of Congregationalists in the Second Great Awakening in a disproportionate number, being inspired to change themselves spiritually and then to change the world around them. So one of the most profound impacts of the Great Awakening and one of its large consequences is a eventual women's rights movement, an eventual women's rights movement. So during the mid 1800s, there was a new look at the role of women in the home. I just coined the cult of domesticity, and it focused on the view of women's work as an important contribution to society. The work that they did at home, almost viewed as like a profession of sorts. And we could go all the way back to this concept in the revolutionary era or in the post-revolutionary era in the founding of the republic. You could say that it's somewhat a continuation of the ideas of republican motherhood, that in this republic the women would serve as central in educating their children about citizenship. And there was a debate about whether or not to include women in the early republic as participating in the elected franchise through voting, etc. Well, the cult of domesticity is this view of respect for women's work. And the essential role that women play in society. And this is, it's an awakening that comes out of the Second Great Awakening, the significance of the women's or the woman's role in society. There are women, though, that work outside of the home. We know that the Lao Mill girls, those women work outside of the home. And then we also see the feminization of the education field. Like the job of teacher becomes increasingly feminized, and men leave teaching during the early 1800s, and women become primarily, they fill that role of educators in the early 1800s. So that is a quite new phenomena. We can also see some strong oppressions of women in American society, and this is just a continuation of oppressions that they have experienced in many centuries prior. Women in the early republic are legally, in many regards, they're legally dead if they're married. They have no legal right to property ownership or business ownership. They don't have legal rights to guardianship of their children. Legally, their husbands it is permitted by law in most states for their husbands to inflict punishment on them, and that's not seen as illegal. Beating one's wife is not seen as illegal. In response to this, we see the fomenting and coalescing of a women's rights movement. And ironically, it comes out of the abolitionist movement. Women who are active in the movement to end slavery are marginalized. They, in the London Conference in 1840, they're not even allowed admission. They're not allowed to be seated there. And so Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton will meet in Seneca Falls, New York, and write a declaration that lists a formal list of grievances for women and ultimately goals that they want to see achieved. That women's rights convention, again, is it is in 1848, Seneca Falls Convention, and the list of grievances that they agree on is called the Declaration of Sentiments, and it's modeled off of the Declaration of Independence. Instead of being addressed to King George III, he has it's addressed to men, and it uses the language of the Declaration of Independence, but instead of all men are created equal, it states all men and women are created equal. Many middle-class white women looking to contribute to reforms in American society joined the abolitionist movement, and there's some noteworthy and very important activists who are women in that movement. And Sarah and Angelina Grimke are two that are noteworthy. These are Southern-born women of Southern Plantation Society, and they both marry Quakers from Pennsylvania, and Quakers have been strongly abolitionist since the early colonial era, and they change their beliefs and their philosophy about slavery, and they appeal to women to advocate for slavery, and particularly they appeal to Southern women. And so one is she's very well spoken, and she speaks at rallies and public forums, and the other sister is more of a writer who is influential in that regard as it relates to the abolitionist movement. And then the temperance movement. Women they make up the largest population of advocates for temperance. Now, what is temperance? Temperance started out as a movement to curb the consumption of alcohol, like slow down the alcohol consumption in American society. Many people looking across 19th century America, especially turn of the century, saw heavy drunkenness in American society. And there were a lot of things that contributed to the temperance movement. And the industrialization of American industry is a cause. Like, people could drink at home, they could be intoxicated at home. But if you're going to go to a textile mill, or if you're going to work in building a canal, it's very dangerous to work in an environment like that and be intoxicated. So the Industrial Revolution was one thing that helped to spur the temperance movement, but the Second Great Awakening also helped to spur a temperance movement. So the idea that one should be more moral and more Christian and more tempered in your behavior, that come out of the Second Great Awakening. And then the third component that is probably a huge cause of the temperance movement is an anti-immigrant feeling. There's a surge in the 1830s and 40s and even 50s of new immigrants into the United States, and many of them are largely Irish Catholic. And Irish Catholics are heavy drinkers, and so like this nativist movement or this anti-immigrant movement helped to encourage the temperance movement. So the temperance movement went from a movement to have Americans reduce the consumption of alcohol to gradually this teetotaler mentality, like no drinking of alcohol at all. And so many states enacted laws, some 13 states enacted laws to reduce the consumption of alcohol or just abolish the sale of alcohol altogether within their states. The American Temperance Society was founded in 1826, and so that's considered, you have a real mainstream idea that alcohol is an evil in society. And even Second Great Awakening preachers like Lyman Beecher preach the sinful nature of alcohol consumption. So, that is an element of Protestant teaching today, but that hasn't always been, and that sort of became an element of Protestant teaching during the Second Great Awakening, during the early half of the 1800s. So some universities started to open their doors to women in the first half of the 19th century. Oberlin College admitted 4 women in 1837, but then we see mostly the formation of all women's colleges. At Troy Female Seminary, a school to teach ministry, opened in 1821. Mary Lyon founded Mont Yolk Female Seminary in 1837. And then by 1820, you see that many elementary schools are opening up opportunities increasingly for girls when they had previously had very few. Now, on the looking at the diverse end of the spectrum for other demographics outside of white America, education for African American girls is very much limited. Elizabeth Blackwell is the first woman to earn a doctorate degree. Catherine Beecher does this health survey about women's health and revolutionizes like some standards in obstetrics and gynecology. And then Amelia Bloomer, this is interesting, she designs loose pants bloomers for women, so we even see change in the way women are dressing. Previously mentioned the Seneca Falls convention. That's Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott hold that convention, and they compose the Declaration of Sentiments that's based on the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. They narrowly pass the inclusion of the goal of suffrage. Like, they agree, but by a slim majority, they agree that women are entitled to the right to vote. They mostly consider, though, the other legal limitations for women, that women don't have any power within the marriages that they are in. The covenants really strip them of all legal protections, and they advocate primarily for women to have the judicial system protect them from harm against their husbands, and to have guardianship rights for their children. But they do include that of suffrage, and they will begin to advocate for the woman's right to vote. Sojourner Truth is a former slave from the state of New York. She won a lawsuit against a white man who, when New York State abolished slavery, he sold her son into slavery in Alabama. She sued him, and she won that suit and was able to get her son back. She was the first black woman to win a lawsuit against a white man. She was a vocal part of both the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement. She gave a speech at a women's rights convention in 1853, and her speech is just called "Ain't I a Woman?" She was not literate, but the speech was dictated, and we have a transcript of the speech, and it uses simple rhetoric and simple logic to advocate for the equality of men and women. And again, she was also an abolitionist.